I was beginning to think that I probably needed more volume on the microphone. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kalebo Boatin. I'm from Ghana, and I have the honor to introduce our speaker for this afternoon session. But before I do that, may I say very few words. So in 2005, I had just finished my undergraduate program, and I was thinking of building a very solid research career in conservation research. And then I started reading the scientific literature and became aware for the very first time that amphibians were really threatening with extinction. And I was very surprised that none of my professors, ever mentioned this. And I was so concerned that these animals are going, and they're probably not going to come back. They were like really going extinct. And so I decided that I needed to do something about it. So I dedicated my life to becoming the first amphibian biologist and herpetologist, for that matter, in my country. It's been an exciting journey. But what I've realized, which makes this talk that we're going to have very important, is that I thought that it would be enough to just go out there and say that, these species are going extinct. Please, they're going extinct. Let's save them. Let's do something. But it doesn't work like that. And it really requires a lot of innovation to be able to get public support to save species like frogs. And that's an area that our speaker had so well excelled. He's worked with teams that have done campaigns that have generated billions of media impressions. So statistics show that even a billion more media impressions than the UN IRIS report on the risk of losing 1 million species. So I think this is definitely a person that we all want to hear and learn from. But even before that, I also want to let you know that he has his PhD in biodiversity conservation, but aside that, he's really a very seasoned photographer. He's actually an multiple award-winning photographer and a very compelling storyteller. If you've not read his book, In Search of Lost Frogs, I think that you should definitely get one. I was reading one on my way here from London to Oxford in the Oxford Tube, and I was so engrossed in it that I forgot to pick my luggage. So, so Robin here owns my luggage. And this is how compelling it is. It's full of suspense and anxieties. I really enjoy reading it. He's the Director of Communications at Global Wildlife Conservation. He's also a co-founder of the Amphibian Survival Alliance, and he's recently found Frame of Mind, which is dedicated to empowering young people to connect with their cultural and natural environment through photography and visual storytelling. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome Robin Moore.
Thank you, Caleb. Wow, I don't know how to live up to that. I'm sounding a little croaky today. I was out partying all night. No, I'm just kidding. Too much planes, but I'll try not to lose my voice by the end of the talk. So I'm just going to talk today about a couple of campaigns that we have worked on to try and elevate the profile of some of the more or lesser charismatic species, or the charismatic microfauna, to try and, stimulate conservation action. And I'm really going to talk about some of the lessons learned along the way, and my journey from amphibian biologist, exploring photography as a way to connect people, and storytelling. So I'll just start with one anecdote. The famous artist Picasso was on a train one day when a fellow passenger approached him and said to him, why don't you paint people the way they are? And Picasso replied, "What do you mean, the way they are?" So the man pulled out his wallet, handed over a photograph of his wife. And Picasso said, "Well, she's very small and very flat." And I think of this anecdote quite a lot because it's the way we receive information, the way we process information depends on the frames through which we are viewing it. And these are frames that are developed through experience, through the culture we're exposed to, and through the stories we tell. So how we respond to an image of a frog when we're put face to face really depends on what we think of frogs. How many people here do not like frogs? I won't judge. But I recently did a poll on Facebook to see if any of my friends had what I found out is called rhinidophobia. And not only was I alarmed to find out there's such a thing, I was equally alarmed to use my photo to illustrate it. And one of my good friends came forward and said, "I have to confess, I have rhinidophobia." And I said, "Well, I met you at a talk that I gave on frogs." And she said, "Well, I didn't think you were going to bring any live ones." So people can still be fascinated, but it's true that a lot of people just have this irrational fear. And that bias even seeps into science. This paper looked at the number of scientific publications on mammals and amphibians in southern Africa and found that 99.8% of publications were on mammals, 0.2% were on threatened amphibians. So our bias towards things that are closer to us on the evolutionary scale, things that have eyelashes, things that we can empathize with, really sort of pervades even science. And when we try to connect people with these messages, it's complicated because people have their values and their frames of reference and their worldviews that are shaped through lived experience, through family, through culture, through exposure to nature, through childhood, but also through the media. And I think as we grow older, more and more through the media, through the stories we're told. But a formative childhood incident, like a frog in your swimming pool, can shape your perception towards these frogs. This is my first ever selfie when I was 7 years old. And this, I'm sure you can tell what I'm doing here. It's so well drawn, but this is me putting frog spawn in an aquarium. And this basically sums up my childhood. I really had the luxury, growing up in Scotland, I would spend a lot of my time in the Highlands just looking for frogs, looking for newts. And this sort of shaped my own frames of reference and shaped my own passion for amphibians. And so I went on to do a PhD on frogs, and I went on to work in conservation. And recognize, as Caleb said, that it's not enough to tell people that frogs are going extinct, especially if people don't really care about frogs. So I started to explore photography as a way of sort of, I think photography can bring an emotional truth to things that science maybe cannot, and can invite people to view things through a different perspective. So this is an image I got of a Amazon gladiator frog, just sort of ghostly in the frame, sort of to highlight the vanishing of amphibians around the world. And a few years ago, I talking about psychedelics yesterday, I wasn't on psychedelics when I did this, but came up with this sort of idea for a more conceptual photographic campaign where we transform this conservation activist into different amphibians and photograph her with the same amphibians, kind of explore the idea that despite changed form, we're all bound by the same fate of environment. It was pretty out there. So this is a Luriston newt, threatened by internet trade. Poison dart frog, which lose their poison when they're fed a different diet. That's what I told her, at least. And then I think it's hard not to look in the eyes of this frog and not feel something, right? I think photography has that power to connect people on that individual level with these species and with these individuals. But when I did Metamorphosis, what I think I was missing was sort of a bigger narrative that I was trying to tell, or I didn't have a way to really engage people in the solutions. So around early 2000s, something started interesting something interesting started happening with a lot of the amphibians, or some amphibians, that were thought to have disappeared. This is a variable harlequin frog in Costa Rica. This species disappeared rapidly and suddenly from Costa Rica and Panama in the 90s when this wave of a deadly fungus swept through. But in the early 2000s, a researcher was there, and a local landowner came up to him and said, "I found these beautiful, orange and black frogs." And he said, "It's impossible, the species had disappeared." But right enough, the species was hanging on. And this inspired me to think about, well, there's a different way to tell this story that is more positive, more engaging. So together with colleagues, the amphibian specialist group at the time, we pulled together a list of 100 amphibian species that were missing to science. And I pulled this into the top 10 most wanted, because people love top 10s, and it just helped to have these poster species, so like the golden toad, very iconic, gastric brooding frog. And it started as a poster, but pretty quickly we had funding to send 33 teams in 20 countries looking for these lost species. So we had the start of a campaign. So this was 2010 when we launched this campaign. I was with Conservation International at the time. I got to go on some of these expeditions, such as looking for the Mesopotamia beaked toad in Colombia. Despite the name, it lives in Colombia. Last seen over 100 years ago. We found some incredible little glass frogs. Here's a baby glass frog on a thumb. And we didn't find the beaked toad, but we did find a new species of beaked toad. And we got some attention around this, and in an interview I sort of made a casual observation that looked like Monty Burns from The Simpsons. And so Time magazine picked it up as their #1 new species. And for me that was sort of a light bulb moment about making these things relevant, culturally relevant, and connecting them to people, things that people can relate to, and also not taking it too seriously, not taking ourselves too seriously. We went to some very remote mountainsides in Haiti, to lush cloud forests that I didn't even know existed in Haiti. We found some incredible tree frogs. And this is a frog that hadn't been seen in 20 years, one of the smallest frogs in the world. And we found it on a quarter coin. So we found this in the cloud forest, and we found 6 species there that hadn't been seen in 20 years. And it really was sort of a positive story to tell about these flagships for conservation in this forest, and to highlight that this forest still exists. Even in Haiti, a lot of people don't realize that this forest is there. So we produced calendars that sort of highlighted the biodiversity of Haiti. We produced 20,000 copies and distributed them in Haiti for free. But the challenge, of course, is when you have people who are living their daily lives struggling for water, struggling for food, struggling for resources. They don't have the luxury of being able to choose, to protect the forest. So I thought a lot about what I could give back, other than just coming in, taking photos, telling their stories. So I worked a lot with the kids in Haiti, the youth. This is a girl called Lovely. She hated frogs when I met her. I found out that a lot of Haitians think that frogs pee in your eye and make you blind. But by just, again, experience, getting them out, teaching them, showing them, they get a real kick out of the fact that I love frogs, that I came all this way to Haiti to just see frogs. They thought I was really wacky. And through photography, I brought down cameras, and through photography, which is a universal language, I can't speak Creole, my French is really bad, but just by taking photos with them and teaching them how to take photos and tell their stories, it broke down those barriers. So I would work with the groups on storyboarding, figuring out the stories that they wanted to tell about their relationship with the environment. They would storyboard stories about restoration, about recovery, and really I think using photography as a way of expression and giving them a platform was really powerful. This is one of the stories that one of the kids produced on charcoal, so just showing from the felling of the trees to the cooking to the market, and then basically what happens to the forest when the trees are felled. And just, again, trying to to use it as a way to sort of encourage that connection. I had the luxury growing up of having that personal experience. When I went to Haiti, these kids are living in the shadow of this national park, and they'd never been in it because they were told it was ugly, there was nothing there. So to give them cameras and encourage them to go out and photograph the birds, the flowers, the plants, the animals, I think gave them a whole new way of experiencing their own backyard. So we produced a book, Frame of Mind Haiti, that we gave to all the kids. We had an exhibit in the local library. I went back 6 months later because I wanted to see so we did 3 workshops over a year and a half, but I went back 6 months later just to see if they'd actually remembered who I was and if they'd taken anything from this experience, and got them each just to write down on a board what photography had inspired them to do. So they got think about the importance of trees, think about my future, think about climate change, and of course, protect frogs. And we worked with the local partner, and just last year we helped create the first ever private nature reserve in Haiti. So 1,200 acres of that forest that the local NGO was able to get the land rights to manage and work with the local communities to protect, providing alternative livelihoods. So it's sort of a testament, I think, to the catalytic effect of some of these rediscoveries or these stories that can become flagships that lead on to these other engagement and opportunities for conservation. So hopping over to the rainforest of Borneo, this is the Wallace's flying frog, one of my favorite bucket list species that I got to see there. This is an incredible young Bornean eared frog. I'd never seen anything like it. Looked like it was carved out of wood. And again, I think one of the things that fascinates me about amphibians is, even though I've been working with amphibians for years, I am still blown away by the diversity, by the beauty, by the variety. So I think there's just an endless amount of stories to tell and an endless amount of photos to be taken. I'd never seen a frog like this in my life. So just incredible to be able to, to showcase these. But Borneo, one of our top 10 lost frogs, we lost for 87 years. The Borneo ear toad was really the holy grail. And it was rediscovered after 87 years in this incredible forest. And again, just became an incredible flagship for conservation. I think for me, the sort of most surprising thing about the search for lost frogs was just how much attention it got. I wasn't prepared for that. For me, it was sort of a fun campaign to try and engage people, talk about amphibian extinction, but through a different frame. But it picked up over 650 news articles in 20 countries and over 1 billion viewers. So it really reached a lot of people. And woven into these stories was the messages about conservation. And even though we found some of these, there are still many that are still lost, still missing, and many on the precipice of extinction. And even the ones we're finding 1 or 2 individuals that can teach us something about what we need to do to protect them. And we also reach some new audiences with articles like this. And then sort of it culminated in a book that I spent a year after that writing and was published a few years ago, In Search for Lost Frogs, as Caleb mentioned. When I joined Global Wildlife Conservation about 5 or 6 years ago, we decided to expand the search for lost frogs. And I think the search for lost frogs was kind of a Trojan horse for delivering messages about conservation in a package sort of discovery, exploration, adventure. So we wanted to really harness that and said, why don't we broaden it to all species? So we reached out to over 100 of the IUCN species specialist groups to connect with the scientists to solicit nominations of lost species. And we got over 1,200. We pulled it into top 25, and we wanted to have representation from all the groups. We wanted to have representation from different geographies. And we also wanted to have good stories to tell. So it was a mixture of the recommendations from scientists, but also just recognizing that this is a vehicle for storytelling and communication. So we wanted to try and balance those. And this Trojan horse was dressed as Daniel Craig. We got him to help us narrate the video launching the Search for Lost Species, which I think helped just get it traction and make a lot of people go, what's Daniel Craig doing with... The tortoise actually peed on him right after this, which we caught on video, so they were both a good sport. I don't think either were traumatized. But our first rediscovery of the Search for Lost Species was actually also, coincidentally, an amphibian, the Jackson's climbing salamander in Guatemala. Now this had been lost for 41 years, and I'd been to Guatemala to look for it unsuccessfully, and it was actually found by a ranger in a reserve that we had helped create a couple of years earlier in the northern Guatemala, 2,000-acre reserve. And on the back of this rediscovery, we did a Save Us Sally campaign, Giving Tuesday, and we raised $44,000 just to help protect the habitat of the salamander and reinforce this reserve for this and other species like the long-limbed salamander that was also rediscovered. So again, just trying to leverage these rediscoveries and these stories for a conservation outcome wherever we can. But possibly the biggest lost species story this year took us all by surprise, I think. It was the Wallace's giant bee, the largest bee in the world. And it was rediscovered in Indonesia. And this is a photo taken by photographer Clay Bolt, who found the bee, and that bee wasn't actually flying over it when he took it. That's a honeybee just put there for reference. But I think just the striking image just caused this to go viral. And this had 2.2 billion media impressions. So it really went out there. And again, this species has been the subject of trade. So although it was technically lost, collectors knew it was there and were trading it on eBay. So we had to wrestle with whether we were going to announce it, but because the collectors already knew it was there, we decided that by shining the spotlight on it, that we could help try and push through protections for it. It was unprotected, wasn't on CITES. So as long as people weren't recognizing it as still being extant, it wasn't being protected. So we decided that because the collectors knew it were there, we weren't highlighting exactly where it was found. We felt that sort of the attention could help, again, catalyze some sort of conservation goals, conservation outcomes. So I think one of the stories that really has captured people's hearts more than any of the others is around a frog. So this is Romeo. He's a Sahuencas water frog in Bolivia. And when I learned about Romeo a couple of years ago, he was the only known individual of his kind, last individual of his kind. He was in a tank in a museum in Cochabamba in Bolivia. He had been collected almost 10 years ago because the chytrid fungus was sweeping through the forests of Bolivia, and they were concerned that they was just going to wipe out this species. So they brought Romeo into captivity. The plan was to develop a conservation breeding program for the species, but the problem was they never found another individual. So they went out and they looked, and they just could not find another frog. So the scientists there, we really feared that Romeo was the last of his kind. And they only lived maybe like 15 years, so 10 years in captivity, we knew Romeo was, kind of getting old. He actually stopped croaking a year earlier. So for his first few years in the tank, he would croak, optimistically. He was an optimist. After 10 years in the tank, I guess your optimism starts to wane a little bit. So we were working with the partners in Bolivia, and we said, well, what can we do as one last gasp effort to try and help Romeo? So naturally, we went to Match.com, because where else would you go? We created a profile for Romeo, and we actually reached out to Match.com just over LinkedIn. We didn't have any connections there, but we said we'd love to do a campaign for Romeo, and they were really excited. They wanted to part of it. And they said, if you do an online fundraiser, we will match everything that you raise. So not only did they sort of embrace Romeo, they offered to match funding to launch expeditions to try and find his Juliet. So we tried to bring a bit of personality. Hi there, I'm Romeo. Not to start off super heavy or anything, but I'm literally the last of my species. So we tried to develop a character for Romeo. We launched it on Valentine's Day, of course. So we made these Valentine's Day cards, rose are red, violets are blue, please help me find a frog cute as you. And people could send these, electronically. And we launched it on Valentine's Day last year, and it really captured people's attention. And I put together a little mashup video that just shows some of the sort of attention it got, and a couple of the videos that I pulled together to tell the story, but on very much a shoestring budget, but just showing so I guess the power of the story in terms of, connecting with people on that sort of emotional level.
In amphibian news,
this could be a first. I want to tell you this really heartwarming story.
But this Valentine's Day,
A suitor named Romeo. Romeo
is the name of an endangered Sahuencas frog, and he's been alone for the last decade.
So after a long search, they found a Juliet, but Romeo hasn't met her yet, and there's still a chance they won't like each other. How picky can you be? I wouldn't marry you if you were the last Sahuencas water frog on Earth.
I don't know which one is Romeo, which one's Oh, hold on. I think that became quite clear there. That was an awkward time, wasn't it?
Once they were cleared of diseases, they were introduced to each other, and clearly, as Dan says, they're getting on extremely well, and they're hoping for a happy ending, not a Romeo and Juliet ending.
We wish them all the very best.
So before we found Juliet, we got over 400 people from 32 countries actually donated to help the quest for Juliet. So it really reached a lot of people, but also, I think, evoked something in people where they wanted to help. I got to go down there after they found Juliet, and this is a photo I got of her. One thing that's unusual about this frog is the eyes are actually forward-facing, which is a really nice opportunity to actually connect people on that sort of eye-to-eye level. And just their eyes are incredible. So I think, these visuals are also important for telling these stories. Romeo really got active on Twitter as he got really excited leading up to the date. So he had sweaty nuptial pads right before the first date. And we set up like We set up a Twitter account just to sort of establish Romeo as sort of a spokes frog. Well, recently there's been a similar situation in Chile where a relative of Romeo, the lower water frog, has been in danger. The last individuals were collected out of a stream that was being dried up for development, and Romeo actually wrote a letter to the lower frogs, made a video for the frogs, and again just used his celebrity status to talk about another similar situation. Leonardo DiCaprio shared one of those posts about the lower frog. So just we want to try and keep his story going, to try and use him as a sort of spokes frog for other species as well. And he also inspired a lot of artwork. A lot of artists started, creating work to depict the relationship between Romeo and Juliet, which was really nice to see, just people giving their own interpretations. We set up a Happy Futures registry so that people could support their new home, furnishings, baby room, dinner dates, so a year's supply of worms, babysitting. Again, just giving people a way to support the ongoing conservation. Finding Juliet, as we know, is the first step. Now comes the challenge of actually breeding the frogs and returning them to the wild. That's the end goal. So they've had their first date. They're getting along well. Romeo's trying, but they haven't yet bred. But we're hoping, they've found around half a dozen of the frogs now. So we found that a population still does exist. And I think importantly also the local people, local communities. This is kids holding up a sort of a plan that says together we can save a species. And it's really heartwarming to see such pride. And I think, again, Romeo's become a real flagship. I think it's put the Museum of Natural History in Cochabamba on the map. And Teresa, who sort of has been a spokesperson for the museum, she gets approached in the street and asked about Romeo, and it's really been an incredible opportunity, and she's been an incredible spokesperson. She was in the video putting the frogs, introducing them for their first date. So why did Romeo swim into the hearts of people around the world? Trying to sort of, I think, dissect what made this sort of success get picked up so much and sort of break through the noise. I think it's way easier to get bad stories picked up in the news. It's harder to get positive stories. And I think the power of possibility is very strong. I think when we talk about optimism, pessimism, I think there's also possibilism, and I think when we present possibilities and give people ways to make a possibility a reality, it can be very powerful in bringing them on the journey with you. And I think sort of Romeo connected something very familiar, so the story of Romeo and Juliet, with something novel, a frog with a Match.com profile. And I think when you bring these disparate things together, it can create that element of surprise, and it can make something memorable. And I think just getting people's attention is so hard in this. We're drinking through a fire hose of content. So I think creating content that just gets people's attention in an instant is critical. So strong visuals and just making these immediate sort of shortcuts to existing references. So I think the Romeo story was critical in sort of enabling people to get it right away what this story was. And I think, again, just not taking ourselves too seriously as we told the story. It's a tricky balance. I trained as a scientist, so sometimes I'm cringing, but I think it's important to walk that line, to not take ourselves too seriously, and to make the messages accessible and scientifically rigorous, but to have fun with it. And I think, obviously we anthropomorphize Romeo, but I think to make people really connect with him and his plight, they were only going to do that on a human level if they could relate to his quest. So I think connecting with that sort of universal human emotion was really key. And I think also One of my colleagues, Lindsay Rennick-Meyer, is a real rock star when it comes to working with the media, has incredible relationships, and that was key too, making personalized stories. She would write to every reporter with a personalized pitch. She would know what they'd written about in the past. She would say, I know you wrote about this other frog, we have this story with Romeo. And I think that was key. It's just not a spray and pray approach. It's a very sort of targeted, we know that we think you'll be interested in this story. And I think sort of, yeah, relationships and being attuned to what people, reporters are writing about and sort of the moment is key, to timing as well. And again, the timing on Valentine's Day, just tying it to that. And I think also importantly is the values that it tapped into. I think often when we talk about conservation, we try to justify why we should save something. And I know personally I feel very uncomfortable when I start talking about economic value or ecosystem services, because that's not what drove me to where I am. And I think we have this sort of wheel. This is a very simplified wheel of values. So we have intrinsic values, we have extrinsic values. Sometimes when we talk about economic value, we're tapping into these extrinsic values. And I'm very cognizant that I think we should be reinforcing intrinsic values, benevolence, universalism. People, we didn't try to convince people that Romeo would make them rich or better looking or better in bed. It was simply, we told his story and people cared. And I think often people try to mix these. We were very careful just to not try to mix intrinsic and extrinsic messaging. Because although our values are fairly ingrained, you can actually activate values. And when you activate a certain value, it also activates the values around it. And if you activate intrinsic values, it makes the extrinsic values less activated. So it's like a balloon, two balloons. So I think a lot about this in terms of the stories we tell, and every story we tell is embracing or reinforcing certain values. So we really try to think about what values we are reinforcing. And I think the more we tell stories about the economic value of nature, we're kind of reinforcing values that put a price tag on something that has value way beyond what we can measure with the pound or the dollar. And I think we need just a more holistic approach. And we need all the stories. We need stories that, depending on your audience, some audiences are going to resonate with the economic arguments. But for us, trying to connect with the public, we were really trying to sort of reinforce those intrinsic values. So end on a quote from Picasso. Others have seen what is and ask why. I see what could be and ask why not. And I think it comes back to this sort of possibility and painting a picture of what we want to achieve and where we can go. And I think bringing people on that journey with us, and I think with Romeo we really learned that engaging people and bringing them on that journey is really powerful, because they want to feel a part of the narrative. So the more that we can give people ways to help and to do something and push a needle, I think it can be very powerful. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will now invite questions. Okay, I see a hand over there. Up there in black. Yes. You.
Thanks so much for your talk. I was really fascinated by how you can see a conservation issue or see a species, and how from these facts in front of you, you can find a story, and furthermore, how you can find a story that you would think could captivate people and create behavior change.
Me too. I'm constantly petrified that I'll never find another good story. It's kind of, there's a magic there that it can, so Romeo, we didn't know if that would take off or not. I'm lucky to work with an organization who is small, very flexible, very nimble, so we have the luxury of being able to be a little bold and experimental, and that I think, allows us to brainstorm just some crazy ideas. Some don't make it, like the leaked sex tape, never made it. Because, I don't know, maybe a little too risque. So it's a balance. We're trying to, you know. But I think in this case, as soon as I heard about this frog in a tank, it sort of, it just struck me as that search for the female was something that could be a really good story. And you just never know where they're going to come from, but it's a lot of it's you know, the people on the ground who have these stories. So I think we work with just so many partners and I think it helps when you do a couple. Then we're made aware of like the lower frog one, and we make the connection with Romeo and try to connect the dots a bit. But yeah, I think it's the challenge is finding the good, authentic stories, because I think you don't want it to be too contrived to make something up, but you have to sort of find the good kernel and then make a good story around it and have fun with it.
Yes, we need.
Thanks for this wonderful talk. I was wondering, while you were speaking, I guess one can look at this as just another conservation intervention, right? And when we think about conservation interventions in general, like the debate that we keep having nowadays anyways is the evaluation side of things. Like, do we evaluate enough, learn from it, see what worked, what didn't work, and go ahead? I was interested to know when you sort of approach these issues, I'm sure there's a lot of planning that goes before doing these things into your audience, the way you do things, but how much of it happens on the other side after these are done? How much of the evaluation side of things come into things, and you ask yourself, okay, where did it work, why did it work, or is it sort of like, okay, story done, it worked, move on, you know, and is there room for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd like to say it was all planned out beforehand, but a lot of this is sort of post-mortem. I think we've learned from like lost species things that we can apply. So when we lost species, we reached out to scientists and reporters and got incredibly positive responses from both, which was very encouraging. You know, we realized there was universal appeal. If both scientists and the media are excited, there's something there. So that encourages us that it's something worth pursuing. We definitely think a lot about the audience, the platforms we want to be telling these on. Obviously, social media is a big one, but then earned media. We don't pay to like do ads or anything. Most of it is from earned media, so just relationships with reporters. And as I mentioned, Lindsay, my colleague, is incredible at having that insight. She started off as a journalist, so she has the perspective of a journalist. So she's pretty good at saying, this is a story that's gonna resonate. But I think, like thinking, it was when I was putting together this talk that I really thought about the values side of things, and that's a good point. You know, there was an article a few years ago that sort of called for more holistic valuing, because it became this sort of dichotomy between the utilitarian value of nature and sort of the intrinsic value. And I don't see it as a dichotomy. I think there's many different ways to value nature. I think we just need to be careful that we are sort of not mixing them. I think when you try to encompass too many different values in one message, it can be more confusing than anything. It's like, well, why should I care? Because it's beautiful, or because it's worth, you know. So I think we're very careful about that. And I think one thing global wildlife conservation tries to embrace is that every species has value, regardless of whether we can measure that or not. And many lost species, they're so rare, it's hard to say what the value is. It's hard to say what will be lost. But I think there will be something diminished if they are lost. And I think we just have to rely on people to sort of recognize that and come to that conclusion themselves. Like, there is people love novelty, people love these stories, so wouldn't our world be diminished? You know, we wouldn't question if a Picasso went up in flames. People, without question, say there's value in that Picasso, even if it doesn't have that utilitarian value. And I think for me, art and nature are interesting in that way, that they're both things that we can choose to protect, that we can choose to give value to, should we wish for their aesthetic and qualities that we can't necessarily, you know, put as a sort of dollar figure.
Thank you for that fascinating and hilarious and heartwarming presentation. I actually felt a little bit emotional about frogs. Who would have thought it? So I have a question that to some degree kind of builds on what you were just talking about with the values. I'm kind of interested in what the main threats are to the frog species that you work on, and whether any of it's kind of a trade issue, as in are people profiting from exploiting these species? And the reason I ask is because I work on sharks, and they're very valuable to people, and we can try and sell, you know, I think they're beautiful, and some other people think they're beautiful, and we can use that as a way of trying to kind of motivate people and give them pride in a species. But if at the end of the day they can make money, you know, if people are poor and they can make lots of money from catching them, I think the beauty message, it just isn't going to be enough. And it kind of goes back to what you were saying about the different types of values. And I wondered whether you had any experience with particular frog species that are, you know, really valuable, for example, that you had managed to change people's behaviour or inspire them through this kind of, I guess, the intrinsic motivation angle.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So Romeo's species was threatened, well, by the chytrid fungus. That's what was believed to have driven the loss. It hasn't been seen in the trade, and it's pretty remote, and actually it's pretty hard to find in these like cold streams. You have to go and look under rocks, so it's not easy to find. So trade isn't a threat to that. Hopefully, you know, it's not going to become one. But I think it's a good point that sometimes when you highlight the beauty of these animals, that it can almost be a curse for them if they become the target of trade. It's definitely something we think about in the messaging, and especially for lost species when we're highlighting that they're still there, whether the last thing we want to do is put an animal or a species at risk. So we're always very vague in saying where they were. We never reveal locations, and we always make sure we have a strategy in place so that there's safeguards there, or that we're going to leverage it. I'm trying to think of an example. It's a tricky one with the trade, because the risk is of trying to appeal to that value and the beauty of these things is that you can make them more appealing. I mean, I know after Finding Nemo that, you know, clownfish were being traded way more, right? It's sort of, so that's definitely a risk, I think, I think it's something we factor in. So the Wallace's giant bee, it was a big consideration. And I think if it hadn't already been on eBay, we probably wouldn't have announced it. We've held back other announcements for that reason, because we don't want to showcase that they're still there. In many cases, better to leave them be. But because Wallace's bee was already on eBay, we knew the collectors knew it was there. So it's not like we were going to be telling them anything, but we wanted to alert the rest of the world that it's still there and being traded and collected, and hope that could push through protections. So, you know, people were fascinated by that bee, and I'm hoping that translates into concern for its survival. If it's going to be wiped out by trade, you know, it's something that we need to be aware of. So we call that rediscovery. I mean, people had been collecting it. We just hadn't seen a live individual or a photo of a live individual, so we don't know where they were getting it, or, you know, it was. So we felt it was important just to showcase it and try to shine the spotlight on it for that reason. You know, we're learning as we go. So again, none of us expected that to get 2.2 billion media impressions. It was just insane how viral that went. And I think you almost become a victim of your success when you're that successful. You get backlash, and, you know, and we just try to walk that line between having a strategy that we can sort of defend as having a conservation outcome that we hope it will help that species rather than put it at any kind of risk.
The Romeo campaign's amazing, and I was just wondering if you could go into a bit more detail on the impact that it actually had on the species. So I appreciate it got people really enthusiastic and people could donate money, but what did it actually do for that species? And I guess the other angle I'm coming from is, okay, so the population in the wild is quite small. How much monitoring is being done, and was it the best thing to take Juliet out of the wild and put her with Romeo in captivity, where at the moment they're not breeding?
Yeah, good question. So the long-term strategy again, so we developed a conservation strategy with the partners, and their strategy did include a breeding and release program, simply because sometimes when the chytrid fungus comes through, it all but wipes out a species, and they can sort of peter along in these populations, and we don't know why they don't bounce back to their former levels. The habitat where Romeo and Juliet were found is incredible lush cloud forest, so we've got no idea why they're still missing from most of the streams in these forests. They seem to be very localized. We are also exploring assisted reproductive approaches to if they don't breed naturally. But I think with amphibians you can produce so many in captivity, tadpoles, and reduce mortality rates so that we'll have a lot more individuals that we can try to repopulate these areas that are, for some reason, they've been wiped out from. So that's a long-term approach. Again, would it be better if they'd been left there? It's hard to say. They're continuing to try and assess the status in the wild. They haven't found any other populations apart from this single plunge pool. So we don't know why they're restricted to there. It's, you know, I think the captive breeding is a controversial approach. I think in this instance it was sort of, Romeo was brought in as a last sort of gasp effort to save the species. The team who have them in captivity have been breeding other related species, so they had a lot of husbandry experience. So we believe that either through natural or assisted reproduction, they will be able to produce tadpoles. The goal is to reintroduce them. So I hope that the strategy will allow us to bring back the frog. It's also, I think, the team's going out into the field and working with local communities. It's been a PR opportunity to showcase that the frog is there. And as you saw with the kids, I think that pride is important. Again, it's become a sort of flagship. I went to the type locality where Romeo was found. It's now a dam. So they destroyed it. There's a risk where they are now that they will come in and do the same. So I think having these flagships and having the eyes of the world on this can be powerful if we have to fight those kind of forces and developments. So I would say as a long-term strategy, I think it's highlighting Romeo as a flagship for this area, highlighting how pristine it is right now, but that we need to keep it that way. And getting people to actually care, I think, is a big step. So it's complicated. I'm with you. Like, I think captive breeding has to be part of a really sort of longer-term strategy to get them back established in the wild. And that is a long-term strategy. You know, once we've done the campaign and they found Juliet, you know, obviously we all want the happy ending story. So we're hoping that they breed naturally, but we're exploring other options. And it's just generated a lot of resources for the species that would not have been there. This museum was struggling, you know, to keep Romeo fed on worms for 10 years. So I'm hoping that it'll have sort of knock-on effects for conservation of not only the species but this area in Bolivia, because I went to the site where Romeo was found, and you know, it's depressing to see it. There's a road that's 3 miles long going into it, just cutting through the forest, and the river no longer exists. So I'm hoping that we can use it to sort of make the argument that this is important to protect.
The last question from Hannah here. Sorry, I saw the hand. Yeah, not right there.
Hi, thanks. Well, repeat the thanks of everyone. Thanks very much for a great presentation. I just wanted to know if you had thoughts on how to deal with these kind of campaign stories that in the end perhaps fail or have an element of failure. So like you said, like they've not actually bred yet. What's the plan of action if that happens, and if there's elements of kind of tempering expectations at the beginning for stories like that, and thoughts you have on dealing with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, when we started the campaign, we thought that probably we would be telling the story of Romeo having to write, you know, obituary for Romeo and using it as an opportunity to talk about extinction. When we found Juliet, obviously it opened up a whole new narrative. And then we weren't getting pressure, like, have they met yet, have they met yet? They both had to be screened for disease, so we didn't even know if they could meet, actually. And that was a really hard one to navigate, because it's like, well, we found Juliet, but they can never meet. It's not a very good story. So it's a good question. I think we just have to be truthful and use it as a sort of an opportunity to showcase how complicated and long-term conservation is. It's not going for a quick win. That finding Juliet's the first step in trying to get this species back in the wild. And if they don't breed, what is the follow-up? And I think we just have to try and be truthful and authentic in how we talk about those things. And if yeah, no, it's a good question, and I think we just constantly trying to balance that, the expectations, because reporters want to know, you know, as soon as the teams were out looking, they wanted everyday updates. We didn't want to announce it until we were ready with sort of answers. So we try to be very strategic in being prepared with the top-line messaging before we announce anything, just so that we're not, you know, caught on the back feet. Of course we always are, because they always think of something to ask that we hadn't thought of. But yeah, I think it's just trying to not deceive, but try to work the narrative so that people get it, and it conveys that this is hard, and it's long term, and it takes effort, it takes time, and it takes resources, because that is the reality, you know.
Thank you very much for this.